This is going to be a quick update on the war, where I look at the Ukrainian offensive and try to look forward into the next phase of the war. I think it's fair to say that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has not been as fast as the Ukrainians had hoped. On the other hand, it's also clear that the Ukrainians are gaining terrain and that it is happening in significant places where there's sort of the sense that maybe things can suddenly accelerate, that maybe there could be a kind of Russian collapse if things continue this way just for a little bit longer. And I think that sort of sums up the phase that we're in right now. It started out like a Ukrainian spring offensive, then it became a summer offensive, and by now I guess it's like a fall offensive. And we should probably just stop adding seasons to the name and instead just talk about the Ukrainian offensive, because it doesn't look like Ukraine will finish this offensive in the coming months, and then it will become a winter offensive and a spring offensive and maybe a summer offensive again. So I think it's less confusing if we just start calling it the Ukrainian offensive, and we understand that this is a long phase of the war where Ukraine has the initiative and they try to sort of break the deadlock. In general, there are two Ukrainian axes of advance. One is around Bakhmut in the northern end of the front line, and the other one is around Robotyne in the southern part. Of these two, the most important one is without doubt the one in the south. And the reason for that is that this is the place where a breakthrough can be decisive for the whole war. Like, if Ukraine is successful there, then it will cut the Russian-occupied area into two, and that will create a whole new operational situation where the Russians will have some very big problems with how they're going to support the forces in Kherson Oblast and in Crimea. And on the other hand, if Ukraine has success around Bakhmut, then that will mean that they will win back some of their land, but it doesn't dramatically change the operational picture. Like, it doesn't cut crucial supply routes or something like that. There is a long land border to Russia, so Russia will probably be able to reinforce the area and stabilize the situation. So that is why the main axis in the Ukrainian offensive is the one in the south. But the offensive around Bakhmut is important as a supporting effort because it forces Russia to spread out. Like, it ties up a lot of Russian soldiers, so it pulls resources out of the Russian defense in the south. I get sometimes asked, like, what if Ukraine is not successful with this summer offensive? Like, the mud season is coming really soon, and that has often been described as a kind of deadline that when the mud season comes, then the Ukrainian offensive will have to stop. So what if they can't make it all the way to the Sea of Azov before that, or at least to the city of Tokmak, which is an important logistical hub that is about 20 kilometers behind the current front line? And I think the answer to that question is pretty simple, actually. If Ukraine can't achieve these goals before the mud season begins, then that will just mean that they will continue after the mud season. Like, in general, there are 2 times a year in Ukraine when the weather is good for military operations. There is the summer period from around May and until October, and then there is the winter period from January and until March when the soil is frozen, so that depends on how cold the winter is. And then there are the mud seasons in between those, so that's like in the spring and in the fall, there's the mud season. And if Ukraine can't achieve these goals now during the summer season, then the mud season may put sort of a damper on things for a little while, but the overall goal will be the same. And I think there are 2 important reasons for believing that the Ukrainian offensive will continue. First, the Ukrainian offensive has not culminated yet. Culmination is the point when a military offensive runs out of energy and they can't move forward anymore. And that happens if the defense is strong enough to hold out, and then eventually the attacker will run out of energy because the attrition sort of drains the resources. But the Ukrainian offensive has not culminated. They are still able to make significant progress. So the reason why the intensity of the offensive may drop for a while is because of the weather, but it's not because the Ukrainian offensive has culminated. And the other reason is that Putin has decided that Russia will not have another round of mobilization at this point. So there are things going on in Russian domestic politics that influence how they fight the war. And it's been clear for some time that the Russian forces have a manpower shortage, that they need more soldiers on the front line, but that for political reasons, the Russian army is just not allowed to get the soldiers that they need. And the reason for that is that Putin is still not confident in the support of the Russian people for this war. So he's trying to shield them from the worst consequences of the war to avoid political protests in Russia. And the way this works is that there was a large wave of mobilization last year in September where they mobilized maybe around 300,000 men. And then there's an ongoing effort to recruit soldiers in other ways. So that is volunteers that sign up because the salary is pretty good, and it's people that sign a contract to get out of legal trouble and those sorts of things. And then the concept is that there is a kind of division in the Russian society where those that are fighting are isolated from the rest of society. So once you are in Ukraine, you will never leave. You stay there and you fight, and you will not get home before the war is over. And what that does is two things. First, if you never rotate your soldiers, then at least if you apply a kind of Excel spreadsheet kind of logic, you don't need as many soldiers, right? Because your soldiers won't be spending time on unproductive things like family visits or resting or rebuilding fighting power. And the other effect is that you isolate the soldiers from the rest of society, and that means that it's easier to uphold a facade for the rest of the population, that everything is fine and they have nothing to worry about. So it makes it possible for the people to pretend that this special military operation has nothing to do with them. From a military perspective, this is not a smart way to do it. If you keep the same soldiers on the front line all the time, then eventually they will become ineffective. They just burn out. So that is why you need regular rotation of the soldiers to sustain the fighting in the long run. And of course, the Russian military commanders, they know this, but for political reasons, they're not doing it because domestic politics are interfering in the military decisions. And Putin apparently believes that doing it this way is better for maintaining popular support for the special military operation. There was a lot of speculation in September that maybe there was a kind of window of opportunity where Putin could do another wave of mobilization. There were regional elections in the beginning of September in Russia, and it was possible that they could make that unpopular decision after the elections were over, and then there could be some protests for a while, but then things could sort of calm down before there were new elections coming up in Russia. Russia has a presidential election in March where Putin will be reelected. And of course, when I'm talking about elections in Russia, then it's not real elections where there is actually a competition between different candidates, but it's a kind of ceremonial process that is supposed to give legitimacy to the regime. And that's why they don't want protests leading into the elections. They want it to look like a real process where people afterwards can think that, well, maybe actually a majority did vote for Putin, so that gives him legitimacy. Like they don't want it to end up like Lukashenko in Belarus in 2020, where the elections were so rigged that nobody believes he actually won. So that is why the elections in Russia are important. But by now, it's pretty clear that they did not opt for a large wave of mobilization in this window that was now. And the reason we can say that is that now in October, the routine autumn draft of conscripts has started, and Russia does not have the capacity to do both, like both drafting conscripts and having a large wave of mobilization. And Russian officials, like Defense Minister Shoigu, have said very clearly that there will not be another wave of mobilization now. And I don't think they would say that if they were actually going to do it. So Russia is not going to have another big wave of mobilization until after the presidential election that will take place on the 17th of March. And that is a long time into the future. Like apparently Putin and the Ministry of Defense believe that the current Russian forces can hold the line long enough to wait for that. But honestly, like I think it's a risky bet. Like when I look at the advances that Ukraine has made on the front line since the middle of August, then this does not look like a Russian force that will be able to hold for another 5 to 6 months. And like maybe they can, but it looks shaky. Let's put it that way. And still, that is the message to the Russian soldiers that this is the task. Like you have to hold this line because reinforcements are not coming. So the way I look at it, the situation now is that Ukraine's offensive may slow down in the coming months because the weather will just make it difficult to drive around in the terrain with armored vehicles. So there will just be too much mud there. But the offensive has not culminated, so Ukraine still has more to push with. The problem will be bad weather and not that Ukraine has run out of energy. And on the Russian side, we have a manpower-deprived force where the soldiers will not be rotated and reinforcements are not coming, at least until after Putin's re-election in March. So in other words, this is not a stalemate. Like, this can go two ways. Either the Ukrainian offensive culminates before they get a real breakthrough, and I think this is especially possible if the West is unable to provide the ammunition that Ukraine needs for the offensive, or else there can be a collapse on the Russian side. Like, we have to remember that the mud season is not terribly long. It's just a couple of months, and during that time, Ukraine will do what they can to keep the pressure on the Russians. Like, they want those Russian soldiers on the front line to keep suffering so they don't get a break. I think we should expect the Ukrainians to use massive amounts of artillery, for example, because that is not something that is dependent on the mud. And then that constant pressure can prepare the battlefield for another Ukrainian push when the soil freezes in the winter. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful or interesting, please give it a like. And thank you very much for watching. I will see you again next time.